Hi everyone, I'm Michal and today we'll go through some of the questions from air law and specifically the topic of aircraft operations. All the questions that you are going to see have been seen in the actual EASA exams across all authorities in the past 60 days. So without any further ado, let's jump into the first question from aircraft operations air law. During cruise, a climb resolution advisory is triggered showing the instruction to climb at 1,500 feet per minute. The pilot realizes that the other aircraft is climbing as well. How should the pilot respond? So, when it comes to questions asking us about resolution advisories and the TCAS in general, the rule of thumb is that you always listen to what the TCAS is telling you. Remember that resolution advisories, as opposed to traffic advisories, are not advisory for the pilot in the cockpit. It is mandatory to follow them. And in these questions, examiners are trying to see if you know that essentially what you see with your eyes can very often be deceptive. So you need to trust the instruments. And in this case, what you need to do is do exactly what the RA is saying, meaning you climb according to the RA 1500 or slightly higher if you feel like the other aircraft might be on your course. However, most often, if you see an aircraft climbing as well, it is probably not the aircraft that is triggering the RA. So in that case, you just follow what it says. And also for these questions, remember that if there is a conflicting instruction from the ATC and the TCAS, you always follow the TCAS as this has the most priority in the air. Going into question number 2. If an ILS glide path becomes inoperative during the approach. So this is a very interesting question, and you'll see during your instrument rating that this is a very practical question as well. And the general rule is, so what happens if you have an approach that has both horizontal and vertical guidance, and you lose the vertical guidance throughout the approach? And actually, what you'll do once you start flying, you'll brief the approach before you start it, and sometimes you will also brief the minimas if the glide path becomes inoperable, or even if the entire approach becomes improbable to do and to conduct, you might actually brief a secondary approach to the same runway using different navigates, like for example VOR DME. In that case, you can of course always go around if you feel that the approach is unsafe, or if you have enough time to prepare for the approach with different minima. So in this case, when you lose the glide path, you can still follow the localizer and continue with manually selected vertical speed to follow the CDFA. Then you are able to actually conduct the approach with less precision. So from the 3D approach, you will be demoted to 2D approach. So the minimas, of course, will go higher. However, you can still continue safely if this was briefed and if you had time to correct and start following the continuous descent final approach, which is the CDFA, which is always the one that, according to EASA, we as pilots should do during non-precision approaches. And this would actually make the first answer the correct one. Or we can read the other ones as well. A go-around must be performed. It does not have to be performed. It can be performed if you feel that the approach is becoming unstable or if you don't feel safe. However, there is no requirement because you can still follow the localizer and the calculated CDFA, or if you have FMS, then it's even better, to higher minima. Of course, AEC should be contacted for further instructions. This question does not make sense. You are ultimately responsible for the safety of the aircraft, and you can advise the ATC about the loss of glide path. However, the decision lies with you, and you are supposed to bring the aircraft to a safe state or to the landing. And it must be continued to the ILS minimum without glide path. So the ILS minimum without the glide path is the localizer minimums only with the CDFA. I've never heard the phrase ILS minimums without glide path, to be honest. And of course, it does not happen automatically. You as a pilot need to have time in the cockpit to think about the situation, assess if you're able to continue, change the minimas, and then proceed with a different approach. Question number 3. On an instrument approach, the initial approach fix marks that. So before we jump into the answer to this question, something to remember for exams and your instrument rating as well is the amount of the segments when it comes to the instrument approach phase. So of course the phase exists for you to bring the aircraft from the en route into the landing on the runway. So you have the arrival phase, which ends at the initial approach fix, and then you have the initial segment, you have the intermediate segment, final approach segment, and lastly you have the missed approach segment. So all these make up for 5 segments in the instrument approach. And also remember that the final approach segment is marked by the final approach fix for non-precision approaches and final approach point for precision approaches. And at the final approach point, you are expected to intercept the glide path or the vertical guidance for the approach. So going back to the question, on an instrument approach, the initial approach fix marks the end point of the star. At the initial approach fix, the initial approach segment begins and the arrival segment ends. So this would make the question, the answer B, the correct one in this case. For question number 4, the vectoring to intercept an ILS localizer course or an MLS final approach track for an independent approach to parallel runways shall be such as to enable the aircraft to be established in level flight at a distance of at least how many miles prior to intercepting the glide path. So prior to intercepting the glide path, or essentially prior to the final approach point for these approaches. And the correct answer will be 2 miles. And this is a very practical question. And this is something to always think about in the back of your head, because sometimes you'll be vectored during the actual approaches. You need to make sure that the ATC, of course, know this and will always try to accommodate you. But sometimes it's always worth to keep an eye on this. You are not vectored any less than 2 miles from the final approach point. And also EASA states that the interception angle from the vectoring to the final approach course needs to be no more than 30 degrees for you to make a safe turn and intercept the glide path or the vertical guidance. Now question number 5. You're flying at flight level 100 and you have clearance to enter the holding at flight level 100. The time for flying the outbound entry heading should be. So the holding theory, and I urge everyone here to take a look at ICAO document 8168, or also known as the PANSOPS, as all the holding theory is outlined there. And the holds are essentially patterns that we do in the air if we need to wait, or if the ATC tells us to do it in order to descend, or if there's something happening and for the traffic flow reasons we need to stay at one point. It consists of 4 key parts. So we have the inbound leg, then we have a turn to outbound, we have the outbound leg, turn to inbound, and so on and so on. Each of these parts, each of these segments will take 1 minute, as of course we always do the rate 1 turn on the turns, or maximum of 25 degrees bank if the rate 1 turns would require the greater bank. And for the theory of the hold itself, remember that the turns will be 1 minute always, unless you are above 14,000 feet. In that case, these would be 1 minute and a half. And there are also some speed restrictions, which we'll not dive into today. However, remember that they are there and you can read them in 8168 document from ICAO. And lastly, remember that the hold provides you with a buffer zone of 5 nautical miles, giving you obstacle clearance and making the hold safe. And in case of a standard hold, we always do right fin turns, and a non-standard hold will be left. So if you do not get any instructions regarding the direction of the turns, this would mean a standard right turn hold. So in the case that we are entering the hold below 14,000 feet or flight level 140, in that case, the time to fly the outbound as well as the inbound segment will be 1 minute or less. And now the last question, asking us about a circling approach. So how is the pilot expected to behave after initial visual contact with the runway has been established? So the circling approach is a visual type of an approach. So we are beginning with a standard, for example, a VOR DME approach into the specific runway. And sometimes if the final approach course is offset from the runway for more than 30 degrees, which is the prerequisite for the straight in landing. In that case, we need to perform something that is called the circling approach. So we need to visually align ourselves with the extended center line. Or sometimes, if the runway does not have an instrument approach for the runway in use, then we make the approach for the opposite runway and then visually enter a circling pattern around the airport to land visually on the runway in use. So what do we do after we have the initial visual contact? And so after we have the visual contact, we follow the minimas for the circling approach, which are always prescribed on the plate if this approach is allowed. In that case, we descend all the way to the minimums. And then with the runway in sight, we follow the pattern or align ourselves and then visually land on the runway. So remember that the visual approach is always, a circling approach, is always visual. So if you lose the visuals with the runway, you are required to go around. And in that case, you would always use the missed approach procedure for the approach you conducted before circling. So in the case of this question, how is the pilot expected to behave after initial contact with the runway has been established? You are required immediately descend below. No, for sure not. The circling prescribes tracks that which we followed. No, not necessarily. This all depends on the chart. I, in my experience, have not yet seen a prescribed track for a circling approach. Continue the circling at the minimum descent altitude, keeping the runway in sight. This sounds very probable, and the circling maneuver will be conducted even in case momentary loss of visual reference. No, you lose the reference, you immediately go around. This makes the answer C the best one in this case. You continue at the MDA, just like you would fly a standard pattern. You align yourself with the runway, and then you just fly base and final as you would fly a standard pattern at the airport. And these are all the questions from the aircraft operations. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something new. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time when we'll cover a different topic from this or the other subject. Thank you, and bye-bye.